And we're really delighted to welcome people to the Ark Synagogue for this evening's session, one of two, around Yom Ha'atzmaut, the State of Israel's Independence Day. There are many reasons for us to be able to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel, and there's many reasons to be concerned as well. The issue of flag waving is one of those things I've struggled with over the past number of years, and suddenly I find myself having the right to reclaim the flag of Israel and to wave it with gusto, and many different feelings that we have been expressed as well. We're really delighted that Robin Moss, who, as far as Rabbi Leah and I are concerned, is the absolute maven for us on all things State of Israel. Having been involved with the UGIA for many years, now breaking out into the secular world, lucky them, but still keeping his finger in. And although I didn't go to the session that he ran at Linwood, I heard wonderful things about it and asked Robin, would he mind coming to the Ark Synagogue to share it with us around Yom Ha'atzmaut? And he thankfully said yes. So over to you, Robin.
Great. Is there a way we can, on that, it says you have to click got it, so that at least the people in the sanctuary can see properly. So good evening, everybody. For those that don't know, I'm Robin. I'm a member here at the Ark at MPLS since pretty much I was born. And amongst other things, I have had a career in Jewish and Israel education. As Rabbi Aaron said, I now run a youth centre in Burnt Oak for the kind of general community, not for the Jewish community, but still keep my hand in with Israel stuff. I'm going to share my screen. I have a presentation, and so those of you, let's have a look if we can make this work. Those of you at home should see it full screen, and those in the sanctuary should be able to see it. Should be able to see it on the screen. So let's see if that's worked. Hopefully it has. And I've called this Israel by comparison. Some ways Israel is, and some ways Israel is not extraordinary. It comes in two parts. So we'll do this week and kind of same time, same place next week. And basically this all began because I suppose two things kind of brought me to prepare this session. The first is we hear a lot in the Jewish community or in the Zionist movement, isn't Israel extraordinary? In so many ways, isn't Israel extraordinary? Actually, not only in the Jewish or Zionist world, people think Israel is extraordinary maybe for very bad reasons as well. And the kind of hyperbolic language we use about Israel kind of always intrigued me. So that was one thing. And it's like, is Israel actually extraordinary? And the second thing I think that kind of always struck me was the original, within Zionism from the start, there was this creative tension between wanting Israel to be extraordinary and wanting Israel to be entirely ordinary. So on the one hand, the idea of creating the exemplary society, the idea of, resurrecting a language and restoring a people to its nationhood and all of that kind of stuff. And on the other hand, some of you may have heard the famous Ben Gurion quote that kind of Zionism will have succeeded when Jewish prostitutes are arrested by Jewish policemen, i.e. that we'll just be like everybody else and maybe that would be no bad thing. And so kind of within Zionism, the idea of ordinary and extraordinary kind of played out as well. So when I was thinking about this, like, how do we define, what do we mean? Is Israel, the Israel that we have today, ordinary or extraordinary? There's lots of ways that you could answer that question. And the way that I've ended up going is through data. And I've always liked, if this works, this cartoon where, there's two people arguing and they're sharing their opinions. And one with his nice, clever laptop says, well, when you two have shared your opinions, I actually have the data. So we'll see whether, we can argue as much as we want about whether Israel is extraordinary or not, but maybe we can see some data to see whether it is. So before we get to is Israel extraordinary or not, we need to answer two questions. First of all, compared to what? And secondly, what do we mean by extraordinary? So let's start with compared to what? So there are lots of, again, possible comparators we could have for Israel. We could compare Israel to like every other country in the world, all 192 or whatever it is states in the world. The challenge with that is, first of all, if I'm going to have a graph, there's just too many countries to fit nicely on one screen. And also on many of the measures that I think are interesting to look at, a lot of countries don't have good data. Another option is to compare Israel to the region it's in, the Middle East or MENA, the Middle East and North Africa. And sometimes that's a very helpful comparison, but Israel clearly on a lot of measures is an outlier, a major outlier compared to many of the other countries in the region. I don't think you need to come to, an hour's session to know that. What about comparing Israel to the West? However we define it. And then there's an interesting question about whether Israel is part of or wants to be part of or should be part of the West. But I think that the West is kind of ill-defined. Like, what exactly is the West? What are the countries that are in it and that are not in it? So what I ended up doing is I've gone with an organization called the OECD. So some of you may have heard the OECD. It is, in English at least, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it means it's got some nicer term in French. The OECD was founded in the early 60s with 20 countries, and it's headquartered in Paris. The picture on the screen is its rather lovely headquarters in the suburb of Paris. And it's gradually expanded, and today the OECD has 38 countries. So who are the OECD, or what is the OECD? The OECD is probably easiest to define as it's the rich-ish, democratic-ish world. So when I say rich-ish, you'll see some of the countries that are in the OECD you probably wouldn't have thought of as like the richest countries in the world. So for example, Turkey is a member of the OECD. When I say democratic or democratic-ish, again, Turkey is kind of democratic and has kind of autocratic tendencies occasionally. But generally, these societies tend to be at least functioning democracies. They tend to be open societies. They tend to have kind of modern capitalist mixed economies. And Israel joined the OECD in 2010. Some of you, if you have been kind of interested in Israel for a while, this was a kind of big moment for Israel. It was seen as Israel kind of, advancing in a certain sense globally. It actually joined in the same year at the same time as Estonia. And since 2010, so in the last 13 years, 4 other countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Colombia, and Costa Rica, have all joined the OECD, and there's a whole bunch of others that would like to. So the OECD kind of provides, I think, a useful set of countries to compare Israel to, because it's small enough that we can actually compare to all of them. And we have very, very good freely available data. One of the things the OECD does, amongst others, is they love data. And you can get it all freely available on oecd.data.org or whatever it is, or data.oecd.org. And whoever the kind people are who've put it all up, thank you very much. That's been really helpful to me. Just to give you again, who is the OECD? So first of all, the OECD represents almost 2/3 of global GDP. So it's like a huge portion of the world economy, but actually only 17% of the global population. So India, China, and nowhere in Africa are part of the OECD. But you can see on the map or through the little flags, these are the countries. Now, there's no test at the end. You don't have to remember all of them, and you're going to see lots of them as we go along. But this just gives you some idea of the kind of spread. So again, it is definitely what we would traditionally think of as the West in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, North America, but it's also partly of Central and South America, Japan, South Korea, places like that. So that is what we mean by who we're going to compare Israel to. Now we need to say, well, how do we know whether something is extraordinary or not? Now, clearly, extraordinary doesn't just mean you're a little bit better than average or a little bit worse than average. And also, I'd hope it doesn't mean you're literally the best or the worst. It's kind of somewhere in the middle, I think, the ordinary sense of the term extraordinary. And basically, I will not bore you with the details, but I looked at various different options. And if you've ever done any, if you remember back to like A or O level statistics and standard deviations and all this kind of thing. And I basically realized this is a synagogue talk on a Thursday night, not a statistics course. So I've done something much simpler, which is to just say, we mean extraordinary if Israel is in the top 5 or bottom 5 countries by rank on a specific measure. There's 38 countries. If it's in the top 5 or the bottom 5, we're going to say it's extraordinary. Also, the other advantage of that is it gives me the chance to say one of my favorite words in the English language, which is an octile, which means an eighth. And it's just a lovely word. So basically, it will mean that Israel is in the top or the bottom octile, roughly. So we now know what we're going to compare Israel to. And we now know what we mean by extraordinary. We can compare Israel to the OECD, and we're going to say if it's in the top or the bottom 5, it's extraordinary. I'm going to give you an example, a kind of frivolous example, so that we can kind of get our head into this and look at some graphs, and then we'll get into some stuff that actually is probably more relevant. And the example I'm going to use is McDonald's, okay, the golden arches. So within the OECD, the measure here is the number of McDonald's per capita. So how many people are there per McDonald's, if you sort of mean. Why McDonald's? Because it's like a global chain and it's kind of everywhere, and we can kind of guess. Out of interest, you could put it in the chat if you want, or in person, which country in the OECD do you think has, actually on this measure, the least per capita, i.e. the most McDonald's is per head? If you had to guess of all of the countries that we saw before. I would guess in the States. America, and it turns out you would be correct. So this is the kind of frivolous graph, and again, I know particularly if you're in here, don't worry too much about the exact details of being able to see absolutely everything. The key thing is you can see we've laid them all out. Israel will always be highlighted in red, so we'll be able to pick out Israel easily. And what I will do, so first of all, just interesting McDonald's fact, Iceland closed all its McDonald's about 15 years ago in the financial crisis. So it has, I suppose, an infinite number per head, like it has no McDonald's at all. But what we will do is we will highlight, you'll see in yellow, hopefully you can all see that on the screen, the top and the bottom 5. So we'll easily be able to see, is Israel extraordinary? And we can see on this, as I said, rather frivolous measure, that Israel does have quite a lot of McDonald's compared to lots of places, similar to Switzerland and Ireland and Austria and the UK. More than the UK actually, but it is not extraordinary. America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and interestingly, Japan are the places where you can go if you love the golden arches and want to find them in every street corner. Turkey, Mexico, Greece, Colombia, if you don't want to find them very often, and Iceland if you literally never want to find McDonald's because they close them all. So this is just to give you some idea of what these graphs are going to look like, and we'll search for the red. We'll search for, and we'll see the yellow band, and you see occasionally I'm going to add a little comment in red on the side just to give a little bit more insight. I should also say for some of the measures, the OECD doesn't collect data for everywhere. So like if there are 25 countries rather than 38, we'll reduce it to like the 4 or the 3 in either end.
I'm just going to come here so I can monitor the chat for you as well. Leo was bang on with
very good.
USA.
Very good. Well, that one may be easier. Some of them I think we'll find as surprising. So what are we going to look at today and next week? So today, we've already looked at McDonald's, obviously, but we'll spend a little bit more time on things that are more important. We're going to talk about demography, so like population structures, life expectancy, size of population, density of population, and so on. We're going to look at the economy. We're going to look at democracy and measures of democratic strength, obviously particularly relevant at the moment in Israel. And we're going to look at defense. And then next week, if you would like to come back or new people will join, we're going to talk about the environment, environmental protection. We're going to talk about COVID. There was a lot of talk about Israel having an exceptional vaccine rollout, for example, you may remember. But like, what was Israel's COVID journey like? We're going to talk about religion and diversity. Spoiler alert, turns out Israel is extraordinary, having a lot of Jews, who would have thought, but it's interestingly extraordinary and not extraordinary other ways as well. And finally, education. So
if you've got comments, please feel free to put it in the chat as well from home so that we can feed these in as you want to.
Lovely. Perfect. So we're going to start with demography. So let's just start with possibly the most basic measure, which is just like the total number of people. So Israel is 8.5 million people and is right bang in the middle pretty much on this measure. Israel has slightly more people than Austria and slightly fewer than Hungary. You can see Israel is neither extraordinary it's neither kind of extraordinarily large or extraordinarily small compared to the OECD. The largest countries in the OECD, America, Mexico, Japan, Turkey, Germany, all with populations of kind of more than 75 million. The smallest, Iceland, 300,000 people. There are more people in the London borough of Barnet, where I work, than there are in Iceland. And Iceland is a country in the OECD, Barnet is not. Luxembourg, Estonia, Latvia, Slovenia. So again, we think of Israel as a very small country in some ways, and in some measures it is. Actually, in the OECD context, it's pretty bang average. But what about population density? Because obviously, America is a very big country. Australia is an absolutely enormous country. And we can see on this measure, Israel is very, very crowded. Israel has the third highest population density in the OECD. There are a lot of people crowded into a narrow strip of land. I should say, for the kind of technical note, the definition that the OECD uses of Israeli when it does population statistics is people within the Green Line. They don't include people who live in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem. On the economic statistics and stuff like that, though, they do, because they're talking about the citizenry. But just in terms of population density, Israel is a very densely populated place. And if you go, you will see there are wide open spaces in the Negev, in the south, but a lot of the center of the country, there's a lot of people. And as we'll see, Israel also has extraordinary population growth. So not only are there a lot of people, but there's going to be even more in the future. Again, if you want the wide open spaces, go to Australia or Canada or Iceland or Norway or Finland. Don't go to Israel or the Netherlands or South Korea. What about Israel's population structure? So this is the percentage of the population in each country that is 14 or under, i.e. the number of children. Israel has the highest percentage of its population under 14 in the OECD, 28%. Interestingly, 28% is the global average for all countries in the world. About 28% of humanity is 14 or under. So Israel is extraordinary within the OECD and within the kind of rich West, or however you want to define it, but actually is entirely ordinary globally. And in many ways, what is extraordinary about Israel is it has a modern, diverse economy and all the other trappings of being in the OECD, whilst having this very globally average population structure. By the way, on the other end of the spectrum, places like Japan, South Korea, Italy, where, barely 10% of the population are children. Those are societies that, they are closing schools and opening nursing homes, if you like. And for them, that's the very profound challenges. Israel is having to open schools because larger and larger numbers of children are being born each year.
Obviously, that breaks down in terms of when you think about religion as well. I know we'll talk about religion next week, but are you going there?
We'll come to that. Well, why does Israel have so many children? Basically, because Israeli women have many children. Israel has by far the highest fertility rate in the OECD, reaching almost 3 children per mother. There is no society, there's no comparable society. Mexico is the closest, barely over 2. France, interestingly, has the third highest fertility rate in the OECD. France has actually quite healthy demographics. We often think of France as kind of like they will go on strike and they're on the edge of societal collapse a lot, but somehow they still have lots of children. If you go to South Korea, fewer than 1 child per mother now. Again, a real challenge for them as they look to their future. The so-called replacement rate, i.e. if you had no immigration or emigration, where your population would be stable, is 2.1 children per woman. And Israel is well in excess of that. So then we have Rabbi Aaron's question, isn't this just because of religious Jews and Arabs? And the answer is no. If you just include secular Israeli Jews, not even people who are national religious or slightly religious or wear a kippah sometimes, people who define as secular, just that population would have the second highest fertility rate in the OECD. You can see just two per mother, just below replacement rate. So it is true that there are communities in Israel, Haredi communities, national religious communities, and Arab communities that do have high fertility rates. But if you like, Jews like us, Jews who we would probably see as our comparators, have considerably higher fertility rate than pretty much any other Jewish population around the world. Now, why is that? There's all sorts of theories. Israel tends to be quite so-called pro-natal. There's tax breaks for having children. There's a very child-friendly environment. If you ever go to Israel with a baby, you will discover that you've got 4 million mothers who will help you to raise that baby. And
that's including the fathers.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. You'll coo along with them. Some people say it's something about the Holocaust and wanting to replenish Jewish populations. Other people say that's psychologizing nonsense. I don't know. I don't know what the truth of the matter is. But part of the answer is no one really knows. No one really knows why it is that Israelis of all communities have lots of children, but it does mean that Israel has a very high percentage of children. But what about at the other end of the age distribution? What about older people? So this is the reverse. This is the percentage of the population that's 65 and older. And here you can see Israel is also extraordinary, but in the other direction. It has the 5th lowest percentage of over 65. About 12% of Israelis, 1 in 8 Israelis is 65 or over. Compare that, by the way, to Japan, where almost a third of the population is over 60. And Italy, these are places that not only have very few children, but also have lots of older people, and they have major demographic challenges for their economies going forward. Here, Israel is amongst the company of Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, Turkey, Chile, countries that are not conventionally thought of as part of the West, and have kind of more globally average population statistics. Israel is very much like that. Now, by the way, that percentage will probably rise over the next few years, because if you like, there's lots of Israelis in their 30s and 40s and 50s who will become in their 60s and 70s and 80s. And as we'll see in a minute, Israel has long life expectancy. But still, Israel at the moment is a country with lots of children and not so many older people. Just talking about life expectancy, this is the life expectancy graph, life expectancy and birth for average for men and women. Japan has the highest life expectancy in the OECD. So I suppose the consolation, if you're kind of the prime minister of Japan, when you've got this crisis where you've got no children and lots of older people, is at least the people have a really fantastic elder years and they live to a ripe and healthy age. All the way at the other end, Latvia. A Latvian today doesn't expect to reach their 74th birthday, which is a little bit sobering. And that's, by the way, alcohol consumption is part of the reason why they don't reach that age. Israel is kind of above average, but actually doesn't have extraordinary life expectancy. Higher than the UK, similar to Ireland, Luxembourg, Italy, France. The average Israeli can expect to live just over 82 years today. So Israel, kind of, if we think about Israel as a society and the kind of composition of the society, we have a society that is pretty unique within the OECD. Many children, not many older people, and long life expectancy. There's one other aspect of Israel in terms of demographically as a society that I wanted to explore. Oh, my mother has joined the waiting room. That's always late to all my talks. Hi, Mum. Which is about Israel as an immigrant society. So obviously Israel, at least when it began, was defined by immigration, by the mass waves of aliyah, whether those be Holocaust survivors or Jewish refugees, Mizrahim, Ethiopian Jews, Russian Jews, and so on. And again, in many ways, the kind of stories we tell of Israel and how we tell the story of Zionism is Israel as this immigrant society. But is it true today? So first of all, just in terms of raw numbers of immigrants, Israel is almost extraordinarily small of the raw number of immigrants that come into Israel every year. It has the 4th lowest. This is a measure where the OECD doesn't collect every country, so I've kind of slimmed down extraordinary a little bit. But within these countries, Israel has the 4th lowest number of immigrants of any OECD country. Now, we saw it has an average population, so we'll see it per capita in a minute. But nonetheless, the idea that there is mass immigration to Israel in just a kind of wave of people is no longer true. Just by comparison, the United States, more than 1 million immigrants came to the United States in 2019. Bear in mind, this was when Trump was president, and all of the rhetoric was how the gates were closed and there'll be no more immigrants and they were going to build the wall and everything. Even despite all of that, 1 million people came to the USA to settle permanently. And, Israel is a fraction of that. If we do it per capita, because you might say, well, Israel has a much smaller population than the US, Israel still is pretty low on this measure, and not as low as it was. But again, it is not the case that, each year, first of all, not that many people are moving to Israel. And secondly, that not many people is not that high a percentage of the population. Here, it's somewhere like Luxembourg, where, it's saying 1 in 30 people in Luxembourg arrived within the previous year. Now, why is that? Because there's just not that many people in Luxembourg, if you see what I mean. Small countries, these are going to make a big difference. But actually, Israel is not a society where if you just walk down the streets and ask people, are you an immigrant, like people, or certainly you're a new immigrant, you're going to get a very high response rate. And then finally, well, hang on a sec, but we know there were waves of immigration before. Yes, you're right, there aren't many new immigrants to Israel today, but what about all of those waves we discussed? And in this respect, Israel is just extraordinary. This is the percentage of each country's population who are foreign born, were not born in the country. The lowest is Mexico. Almost every Mexican was born in Mexico, and Poland and Turkey and Slovakia, Chile, Lithuania. These are places where fewer than 5% of the population were born abroad. On the other end of the spectrum, almost 50% of Luxembourgish people, I don't know the right word, people in Luxembourg.
Luxembourgers, I believe.
Luxembourgers, something like that, yes, burgers from Luxem. And almost a third of Swiss and Australians were born abroad. In Israel, that percentage is now close to 20%. If we were in 1948, 1958, 1968, that would have been way, way, way higher. The number of Sabras, the percentage of Sabras, native-born Israelis, would have been way, way lower. Whereas today, the majority of Israelis were born in Israel. And indeed, I think in about 3 or 4 years, we'll reach the point where the majority of Israelis were born in Israel to Israeli-born parents, which will be an interesting transition moment for Israel as a society away from the model, as I said, that's kind of the way that we think about and we'll talk about Israel as an immigrant society, a society defined by immigration, to one that has its own kind of internal culture. So that's just some thoughts about Israel demographically. How are we doing time-wise? Oh, we're okay. Let's talk about Israel economically. And again, a lot of what we think about when we think about Israel is kind of the high-tech nation, the innovation society, really the miracle of Israel going from not existing 75 years ago to now being a kind of powerhouse of the global economy. So again, let's just start with the basics. How big is the Israeli economy? Just purely in kind of cash terms, well, the largest economy in the OECD by a country mile is America. I hadn't quite appreciated how much bigger the American economy is to like everything else until I did this research, even compared to Japan, Germany, and so on. The UK is the 5th largest economy in the OECD. Israel is just below average. In terms of how rich Israel is, so this is probably a better measure, GDP per capita, like how much the country produces divided by the number of people who live there. Israel is bang average. Israel provides for its population within the OECD an average standard of living, if you like. Not quite the scaling heights of Ireland and Luxembourg and Switzerland and Norway, but equally it's not a Colombia or a Mexico or a Chile or a Greece or a Costa Rica. Israel is basically like New Zealand. Again, when we put it like that, is that an extraordinary statement or a very ordinary statement? You can kind of see it both ways. Something that you can do that's quite fun, the OECD, one of the things they do is they do projections. So the UN projects population and the OECD projects economic growth, and both of them project to 2060. So if you roll the whole calendar forward by their projections, you can say, will this change in 2060, in 40 years' time? This is the answer. Basically, no. Israel will remain, they think, bang average in 2060. By the way, in 2060, they reckon this will be an Israel of 14.5 million people, a UK of about 71 million people. And today, Israel is 8.5 million and feels crowded and feels vibrant, lots of children and energy. When it's got another, 6 million people, it's going to be interesting to see what will that look like, what will that feel like? And next week, when we talk about the environment, what effect will that have on the environment in Israel? But I mean, this one, I think to some extent you should take with a pinch of salt, because who knows what's going to happen in 2033, let alone in 2060. But nonetheless, this is what the OECD tell us. What about the kind of structure of the Israeli economy, how Israel operates? And, is Israel a trading nation? Again, we often think about Israel's big export-led industries, particularly high tech. And again, Israel is in this sense quite extraordinary. It has, in technical terms, a positive balance of payments. In other words, it exports more than it imports, and doesn't have quite the highest. Norway has the highest as a percentage of their GDP, but it's the 4th highest in the OECD. It is an outward-facing economy, which is a great thing if you're in that section of the Israeli economy, the high-tech section that is, that relies upon this stuff, but is a challenge for Israel. For example, they're very, very dependent on currency exchange rates. Because if the dollar rate changes, then they will become more or less competitive, and they need those industries to be competitive. And many of you be aware that at the moment, the shekel is not doing very well because people are worried about the current political crisis in Israel, and basically when your currency weakens, that's good for your exports, bad for your imports. So at the moment, that's probably a good thing. Far be it from me to say the reason there's a political crisis in Israel is to boost its exports, but But, let the conspiracy theories begin. What about if you're into stocks and shares? Some of you will know that there's extensive efforts within the Jewish community to get people to invest in Israel bonds and put money into Israeli companies. If you put your nest egg into the main exchange of each of these countries, would Israel have been a good bet? The answer is not particularly. Turkey is the great winner here, which none of us would have thought. The Turkish share price return over the last 10 years has been like almost 600%. Just in 2022 alone, they're like equivalent to the FTSE 100, which is called the BIST 100, which I didn't know, but is almost tripled in value. Who knew? Israel, on the other hand, is kind of not quite extraordinarily bad. Spain, Luxembourg, if you really wanted to have lost some money, but is not particularly good. Actually slightly better than the UK, which also hasn't been a particularly good bet. And those who have your pensions invested in these kind of things will know that, because every year they send you a nice thing saying not only has it not grown by very much, but they've taken a chunk off in fees. But that's the nature of the beast. There is, what about recently? How's Israel doing at the moment? So this is the most recent quarterly GDP growth. And again, Israel is positive, which is good, but pretty, only just above average. Again, places like Iceland, Turkey, Ireland are the places at the moment that are really booming. What about the forecast for the near future? Well, actually, Israel, they think, is going to do really well in 2024. So maybe the answer is now is the time to invest in Israel. It's not been good for the last 10 years, but at least the people who do these things think that Israel is going to have the highest GDP growth at the end of next year of anywhere in the OECD. I don't know how they can make such a prediction, but that's why they're paid the big bucks, I suppose.
And the UK is definitely not.
The UK is right at the bottom, is the lowest. They reckon we're going to have the lowest GDP growth at the end of next year, which is a slightly depressing thought for those of us here, but it is what it is. Well, what about salaries? Is it worth, it's all very well, GDP and, share price rises and everything, but actually what about people's take-home pay? Israel, in this sense, again, is pretty average, slightly below average, actually. It doesn't have extraordinarily low salaries, but on the other hand, it has nowhere near the salaries of some of the richest countries in the OECD. By the way, another interesting statistic, America still has the highest average salaries in the OECD. Even though we think of America as having major economic challenges and problems, the average salary, the median, more accurately, is still the highest in the OECD. Israel has salaries comparable to Lithuania, Italy, South Korea, Slovenia, not Iceland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, the US. Just as we kind of move to the end of talking about the economy, one thing that's been talked about a lot with Israel is inequality. So Israel has had an economic miracle and has grown rich, but that the fruits of that labor have not been equally dispersed across the society. And that was, again, definitely a few years ago, a kind of major topic of education in Israel, and Jewish education was, is Israel an unequal society, the most unequal society? Is that right or wrong? And so on. So let's see. Let's compare Israel to other societies in the OECD. Well, the most famous and common measure of inequality is this thing called the Gini coefficient, where if you have 0, it would mean that it's like complete communism. Everyone would have exactly the same wealth. And if it was 1, one person would have everything and everyone else would have nothing. On this measure, Israel has, high inequality, but not exceptionally bad. The most unequal society in the OECD is Costa Rica. Who knew? But it is. Chile, Mexico, Turkey, and again, America, very rich, but a very unequal society. Israel is not the most unequal society in the OECD at the moment. It maybe was a few years ago, but maybe we'll be happy to know it's not at the moment. However, on other measures, Israel does much worse. So this is poverty, the poverty rate. Israel has the second highest poverty rate in the OECD. In other words, it has the second highest percentage of the population who live below the poverty line. In this sense, countries like Iceland, the Czech Republic, Finland do very, very well. The Nordics, famously do well on these measures. But Israel does not. Israel has a large percentage of its population are poor. Poor here is defined as below 60% of the national average income, which is like the kind of the poverty rate kind of internationally defined poverty rate. Israel is much poorer than the UK, much poorer than the US, even much poorer than somewhere like Greece, which had like an economic collapse. And that certainly is something that anyone who cares about Israel should worry about. Another thing that's interesting is people in Israel, in Hebrew, there's this word, a frayer, which means like a sucker. And Israelis don't want to be a fry, you don't want to be a sucker. And people talk about, but Israel's such a rip-off. You go there and everything's so expensive, and food is so expensive, and everything's so expensive. And indeed, the cost of living in Israel is really expensive. Israel is extraordinarily rip-off. We talk about rip-off Britain. Britain is kind of middling on this measure. If you really want to go somewhere where your pound or your shekel or your forint or whatever it is will stretch a long way, go and live in Turkey or Colombia or Poland or Mexico or maybe Hungary. Don't, for goodness sake, go and live in Iceland or Switzerland or indeed in Israel. So Israelis are right when they complain about the cost of living. Genuinely, compared to other comparable societies, the cost of living is really high. But people often say, well, hang on a sec, that's really just because of house prices. And again, if anyone's ever tried to buy property in Israel or just nosy through a kind of estate agent's window, property in Israel is, I mean, we live in London, or some of us live in London, right? And it's pretty expensive here. It's astronomically expensive in Israel. But actually, Israeli house price growth has not been anywhere near the worst in the OECD, and has been slightly greater than the UK, but less than, for example, in America or in Germany, much less than somewhere like Hungary or the Czech Republic or Portugal or places like that. Those are places where it's house price growth that has driven this fall in living standards. That's actually not the case in Israel. The reason that Israel is, the cost of living is so high in Israel is the cost of basic goods are really high because they import a lot. There are kind of monopolies or very small numbers of producers of a lot of consumer goods. Things like you can't buy land in Israel. It's all rented and loaned, and it's often done on very unfair and not great terms. Israel doesn't have, for example, a domestic car industry, so it has to import all the cars, and they put incredible taxes on stuff like that. Those are the reasons that Israel has it's so expensive in Israel, not just because houses are expensive. In this term, Israel is bang ordinary, right in the middle. Finally, let's just think a little bit about, the startup nation, the innovation society. Is it true anymore that Israel, that story is a story that is true? So I've just got two measures here that give us some sense of what's going on in Israel today in terms of innovation compared to the OECD. So this is an interesting one. This is about the number of patents. So a good measure of innovation is how many patents you per year per head of population, or per 100,000 population in this case, each country is doing. And if a country is innovative, it's going to have a lot of patenting. You can see the winners here are Japan and South Korea. Places, that really are very high tech, kind of, that's the foundation of their economic success. And they remain the two highest on average patent countries in the world. Israel comes in fifth, which is on our measure extraordinary, but actually Germany on average has more patents than Israel. Do we think of Germany as an innovation society? I don't know, maybe if you've got a nice suave car, but I wouldn't have necessarily said that was how we think of Germany. On the other hand, by the way, if you are living in Colombia or Mexico or Costa Rica, places like that, there are almost no patents being made, and the foundation of their economy is going to have to be something very different. The high-tech industry there's a reason you've never heard of the high-tech miracle that is Costa Rica, because it's not happening. And finally, another measure of innovation is research and development, R&D. How much of a country's wealth are you putting into speculative, let's try and discover something new? And on this measure, Israel is not only extraordinary, but is the highest. Israel has the highest percentage of its GDP spent on R&D in the OECD, more even than South Korea. More than 5% of Israel's national income is spent on R&D, which is like head and shoulders above almost anywhere else. The UK on this measure is very average, just below 2%. So if you like, there are more than twice as much of the national income in Israel is being spent on the future, on discovering something new, on inventing, on innovating, than is in the UK. And again, somewhere like Mexico is spending less than 1% of its national income. So I think in some ways, yes, the story of the startup nation, the story of Israel as an innovation society is still true, and not just in kind of a nice book or a nice glossy pamphlet, but actually compared to the OECD, compared to our comparator class. So we've done demography, we've talked about the economy, We've now got two shorter sections to finish today, and then I'm sure we'll have some time for questions. We're going to just move on to say something about democracy. And this, it's interesting, I prepared this presentation for Limud Festival, which was in December, and just before the new government was formed. Now, 4 months later, suddenly it's become even more relevant because, of course, there's major concern amongst significant portions of the Israeli population that Israeli democracy is a threat. So let's see what are the features and the structures of Israeli democracy. And actually here, this is one bit where I'm going to kind of get on my high horse a little bit because some of the ways we talk about Israeli democracy frustrate me. So the first one is people say Israel has too many elections. They have an election every 5 minutes. You know, all Israel does is have elections. And I say, compared to where? And people say, what do you mean compared to where? And I say, well, how do you mean too many elections? Like, does it have too many? Does it not have too many? Well, again, the advantage of doing a presentation like this is I could look this up. I'd like to thank Wikipedia for this. It just has unbelievable lists of elections in every country. So this is, since the 14th of May 1948, i.e. since Israel was founded, the number of general elections that countries have had for their legislature. And Israel has had 25 elections. America in that time has had close to 40 because they re-elect their entire house every 2 years. Australia has had more than 30. Someone like Greece has had more elections than America. Japan, Denmark, Mexico, Colombia, New Zealand. Are these countries with too many elections, or they're just countries that sometimes have elections? Israel doesn't have too many elections. Israel has, a slightly above average number of elections. If you really don't like elections, go and live in Luxembourg or Chile, where they barely ever occasionally have elections. Just some interesting things about this. As I said, the US re-elects its house every 2 years. Spain under Franco had no parliamentary elections for 40 years, which is a kind of a crazy thing to think about today. And Israel did have a lot of elections in 2019, 20, and 2021. It had 5. If there had just been one election in that period, like a decisive election, Israel would have moved six places kind of to the left. It would have been pretty much bang average in the OECD. So the only reason today that Israel is above average in the OECD for elections is because it just had 5. If it had just had one election, it would have been literally average. So Israel does not have too many elections. Maybe you can never have too many elections, but even compared to the rest of the OECD, it doesn't. What about leaders? Does Israel change its leadership a lot? Well, Israel actually, again, is pretty average on this measure. We have had very long-standing prime ministers. So Ben-Gurion was the prime minister for a long time. Benjamin Netanyahu has now surpassed Ben-Gurion's number of years in office. But actually, Israel has had a pretty average number of leaders in its time. Again, if you like your leaders to be have incredible longevity, go to Luxembourg or Germany or Spain or France. If you like to change leaders every year, Switzerland has this slightly bizarre confederacy structure where literally the head of the country changes every year. So Switzerland has changed its leader more than 60 times since the time that Israel has changed its leader, like 13. What about how old the democracy is? So obviously, in one sense, there's kind of contested definitions of what do we mean by democracy and when does a country become a democracy. One definition, which I think is quite helpful, is you become a democracy when you have the first successful, peaceful transfer of power. So the ruling party loses and a new party turns up, and there's not a coup or there's not, it's very easy to be a democracy if the same party wins every time. So on that measure, for example, South Africa is not yet a democracy because the ANC hasn't lost yet. I'm not saying in another sense, of course, South Africa is a democracy in another sense, but just in this terms, it's not. If we take this measure about peaceful transfers of power, actually, good old Blighty, the UK is the oldest democracy in the OECD. We've been going for more than 250 years. Israel is slightly below average, but pretty average. In this sense, Israel became a democracy in 1977, because that's when the Mapai and its successors, the old Labour Party, lost power, and the country didn't stop being democratic. A new government came in, and everyone moved on with their lives. And that's a very, very important moment in the life of any country, because that's the point where really democracy becomes institutionalized. So Israel is not exceptional either in the length of its democracy or the shortness of its democracy compared to the OECD. What about having too many politicians or not enough? The UK, we have a lot of politicians. We have a big House of Commons and an enormous House of Lords, and we have more than 1,400 legislators, which is kind of mad when you think about it. We have by far the largest parliament in the OECD. On the other end of the spectrum, there are something like 30 MPs or MP equivalents in the whole of Costa Rica. It's like, you have to struggle to find one. They must all do because they must have like committees and like, the ministers and everything, like must all do everything. Israel has 120 legislatures, one house only, and is not quite extraordinarily small in terms of its number of legislatures, which is pretty close. It's the 7th lowest number in the OECD. Just done by kind of per capita, Israel moves up a little bit because obviously, there aren't so many people in Costa Rica, that kind of thing. But Israel still, comparatively, is pretty politician light. And it's actually quite a big challenge for Israel because, for example, they have 120 people in the Knesset. Within the coalition, a whole bunch of them are ministers. And then some of the other ones, are the people who are like on the equivalent of select committees. And actually, there aren't that many politicians in Israel to do all of the jobs that we need politicians to do. And there have been proposals to increase the size of the Knesset. Bear in mind that when Israel was founded, it had 600,000 people and 120 politicians. And today it's got 8.5 million and 120 politicians. So it's interesting. Nobody really talks about, when we talk about the strength of Israeli democracy or the weakness, maybe Israel just needs some more politicians. You're not going to hear that in the UK where we have, 1,400 of them, but maybe it would help in Israel. What about freedom in Israel? So here, the leading international comparator is a thing called Freedom House, which is an NGO which rates countries based on how free they are. And again, Israel is very free globally, but we're not comparing to every other country in the world. We know Israel is much freer than Syria or Lebanon or Egypt or the Palestinian territories. But what about compared to the OECD? Well, here I think is where anyone who cares about Israel should worry, because actually Israel has extraordinarily low levels of freedom compared to the OECD. So the way that the score works is there's a total score, where on this measure Israel is the 5th lowest in the world, and then it's broken down between political rights, where Israel is just about out of extraordinary, but is still the 7th lowest in the OECD, 58th equal globally for what it's worth, and civil rights, where Israel is the 4th lowest in the OECD, again, 81st equally globally. But globally, I think, is not the comparator we want here. We want Israel to be an exemplary democracy that is of the same kind as the rest of the OECD. And on all of these measures, Israel is not as free as it could be. And I think, as I said, anyone who cares about Israel, whether you're on the right or the left, whether you agree with the current reforms in Israel or think they're going to destroy Israeli democracy, this is all from before that. Israel already had major challenges with its political and civil liberties. And also, this is not talking at all about the situation with Palestinians in the West Bank, which is a whole other situation. And this is about the Israeli citizenry itself. And again, I think anyone who cares about Israel wants an Israel that is free. Finally, what about something that we often think of as a traditional, if there's one area where Israel is going to be extraordinary, surely it's going to be defense. So first of all, there's a thing I discovered called the Global Peace Index. Quite how you put these things together, who knows? But the idea is that the higher the higher number you have, the less peaceable you are, and the lower number you have, the more peaceable you are. This is not just about like war. It's also about, for example, police violence against citizens within the country and stuff like that. The ownership of guns among the citizenry, things like that. And Israel, perhaps unsurprisingly, is one of the less peaceable nations of the OECD. It is not the highest. Turkey is the least peaceable nation, but it is still the 4th least peaceable, which is sad. Again, if you want to go somewhere that's very peaceful, go to Iceland, and you won't be able to find McDonald's. But we know, and we know that one of the reasons Israel is not peaceable is that it faces major external threats. It's in a region of the world that itself is pretty unstable, and it's in a region of the world where, at least for most of the last 75 years, a lot of that bit of the world has not wanted it there. Maybe things have been interchanged a little bit in recent years, but still. Israel spends the highest percentage of its GDP on defense. This may not come as a surprise, but it's useful to see it actually down in a graph. It spends 1.5 times as much even as America as a percentage of its national income. By the way, it spends 5.5%. In the mid-70s, Israel spent 30% of its GDP on defense. That's partly because the Israeli economy was in a much worse state. The GDP was lower, but also, the spend on the army was just so much more. And even though it seems paradoxical when we think of Israel as under such great threat today, actually Israel comparatively has so much more of a qualitative advantage compared to the rest of the region that it's in, that it actually doesn't need to spend as much of its GDP as it used to. Maybe that's some good news. Why does Israel spend so much GDP on defense, though, compared to everywhere else? Well, because it has an army, has a conscripted and quite large army. How big is this army, again, compared to the rest of the OECD? Well, the answer is it's pretty big. It's the third largest in the OECD, but it is nowhere near the biggest. And I hadn't quite appreciated that the biggest army in the OECD by a country mile is the South Korean army. The South Korean, and again, it kind of makes sense when you think about it, when you think about who their northern neighbor is. But the South Korean army numbers more than 3.5 million people. It's like almost twice or 1.5 times the size of the US army. And then the US military is this kind of global presence. South Korea is just concentrated in a peninsula. But after South Korea and the US, Israel has the third largest army in the OECD. And on the one hand, that says something, but then again, let's think about this per capita, because America is a much bigger country than Israel. This is the same measure, but as a kind of percentage of the population. So what percentage of the population is currently in the military? South Korea, again, is the highest here. More than 1 in 7 South Koreans is currently serving in their military, which is a kind of, again, extraordinary number. Israel comes pretty close behind, just slightly less than 7%. Almost 1 in 14 South Koreans, 7% is 14. 1 in 14, just under 1 in 14 Israelis is currently in the army or is on active reserve duty. The next is Finland, just joined NATO, which again has conscription, and then you can see it trails down. Most countries in the world, most countries in the OECD, fewer than 1% of the population is in the army. In the UK, it's less than 0.5%. Again, if you just intuitively, that makes sense. If you go down the street in Poland, Italy, the UK, Australia, even the US or Turkey, and you said, are you currently in the military? Probably you could speak to dozens, if not hundreds of people before you got someone who said yes. In Israel, on average, every 14th person would say yes, or indeed would be in uniform.
Paul, who has a real fond interest in the armed forces, having been asked whether...
Does South Korea have conscription? Yes, South Korea does have conscription. I believe not for women, actually. I think Israel is the only country that conscripts women, but South Korea not only has conscription, but has much longer conscription than Israel. I think it's like 6 years you have to do or something like that. Anyway, the interesting things you discover when you compare to the OECD is all these minutiae. And just to round off with a couple of others. Again, this the powers that be in the kind of global defense industry have this index they call the power index. How powerful is a country? How much is it able to project its military? The US remains the most powerful by some distance in the OECD. Interestingly, the second most powerful military they reckon is Japan, which is kind of fascinating, given that Japan, after the war, is not meant to have an aggressive military, but has the second highest. Israel's it does pretty well. You can see where the red line is, but it is nowhere near the most powerful military in the world. The reason for that, even though we talk about how effective the Israeli military is, and it is that Israel by design is not really interested in force projection much beyond its own borders. It wants, if you like, to be able to bomb Syria and conduct operations in Lebanon, but it has no interest in building an aircraft carrier to send troops to Southeast Asia, whereas many of the other countries, including the UK, France, see force projection globally. And finally, just an interesting statistic about peacekeeping. So this is about UN peacekeepers, which are the countries which give their troops to be UN peacekeepers. Now, one interesting thing is that basically the answer is almost nobody gives any. Italy, which gives the highest number of its troops to UN peacekeeping operations, currently has fewer than 1,000 soldiers as peacekeepers. The whole of the OECD gives less than 10% of all UN peacekeepers. Bangladesh has more UN peacekeepers than the entire OECD put together, which is kind of interesting about the global burden of peacekeeping. Israel is the only country in the OECD that has a military of any size, that has 0 peacekeepers. Now, that's partly because the UN is not particularly keen on Israeli peacekeepers because they see them as, Israel is kind of controversial within the international system to some extent. But it's also that Israel kind of doesn't love the UN, I think it's fair to say, and wouldn't trust the Israeli troops being under UN command. Interestingly, though, there is a very thriving kind of technological exchange between the UN and Israel. So many of the vehicles and munitions and stuff that UN peacekeepers use are Israeli designs because Israel has very good designs in this respect. So those troop carriers that you see in the blue helmets, maybe they're kind of made in Tel Aviv. But nonetheless, Israel is extraordinary in not really helping to keep the peace in this sense. So what have we learned today about areas where Israel is actually extraordinary? I'm not going to read the whole list, but you can see on screen. These are the ways that we've discovered that Israel is actually extraordinary. Some of them I would imagine you kind of knew before and came as no surprise, like Israel has high spend on its military. Maybe others come as more of a surprise, that Israel really, really does have a high poverty rate. Israel really does have this really unusual demographic. Lots of young people, not many older people, high fertility rates. Maybe it comes as a bit of a surprise that the Israeli economy is in many ways not that extraordinary. In some ways it is, but in many ways is not. But that the startup nation maybe is still true. Patents, R&D. And next time we'll talk about COVID and education and lots of other fun things. But for today, we'll leave it there. We've got a few minutes if anyone wants to ask questions, either on the chat or in the room. I hope that was kind of a bit of fun. I'm going to stop the screen share so we can see each other, and hopefully we learned something as well. Thank you, Patricia. That's really kind.
Absolutely fantastic. So one thing we learned this evening is that Robin Moss is quite extraordinary, really incredible. And thank you for doing all the number crunching to give us facts to be able to pass on to other people tonight. Really amazing. And as my home daughter says, OMG, everybody should be watching this. So OMG, it's one of those things where we all make pronouncements about Israel, but it's incredible to actually have some facts to back it up as well.
Well, I will just say, not that obviously people can join next week or not, and I'm happy to share the slides, but particularly one of the things I learned the most doing this was about COVID and Israel's COVID journey. The waves that it had, deaths per capita, vaccination rate, and so on and so on. So, of all of the things, some of it is, interesting for the sake of being interesting. Others maybe is a bit frivolous, like McDonald's is. But I think certainly for next week, tune in at least for the 15 minutes we'll spend talking about Israel's COVID journey.
Definitely. A fantastic, amazing evening. Thank you so much indeed, Robin. Thank you all for joining us. Tell your friends and family about this. We will put the video up on our website as well, and we'll let you know where it is. So you can share it with friends and family, and so they might want to be here in person next week as well. You're welcome to come into the synagogue itself or to join us wherever you are. So Laila Tov to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Also, I should say, because next time will be after Hag Atzmaut Sameach, and it's Yom HaZikaron next Tuesday evening, Monday evening to Tuesday, and it's Yom HaAtzmaut Tuesday evening to Wednesday.
Yeah, if you want to join Liberal Judaism, their Letters of 75, a number of our members are going to be participating in that. Laila Tov.